what I think is so powerful from my collaborators' words there are the ways that these everyday incidences that become very normalized in so many of our organizations have a traumatic effect, right? I've been in many work retreats where predominantly white folks in the room, and it's the day of or the day after a highly traumatizing incident has happened and nobody even acknowledges it or
Mhm.
speaks about it. I've also been in spaces where I witnessed racial macro and microaggressions happening where, especially I think in our organizations, women of color are often told the words like what my collaborator said, you're too passionate, you're too emotional, you're too much. And the traumatizing effect that that can have on folks. I think that these words, many of them were uttered by supervisors, but it goes beyond supervisors as well. And it really speaks to some of the insidious nature of the ways that trauma shows up in our workplaces and in our organizations. And for me, kind of a core principle of how I think about my own organizing or social justice work is centering the margins. And
Mhm.
when we center folks who are at the nexus of multiple forms of oppression, and we hear those folks' insights about what's wrong in our organizations and what needs to change and how it should change, inevitably that benefits everyone. Even though I think these words are heavy, there's also a lot of wisdom and insight in them that can show us ways that we can transform our organizations for everyone.
This is Social Justice Origin Stories. I'm your host, Rolando Tompkins Jones. Social Justice Origin Stories is a storytelling project that highlights personal stories and defining moments that have inspired individuals and organizations to labor for equity and social justice. Through truth telling, the honest sharing of their experiences, storytellers teach us about themselves, enabling us to learn about ourselves and our world through their stories. By reconnecting with pivotal moments of activation in their lives, they invite us to do the same. At Social Justice Origin Stories, we believe that there's power in storytelling and lived experience is experience. There's room enough for all of us to do this work. There are many ways to contribute, and our contributions don't need to be the same. We can enter and remain engaged in the work using the gifts that are special to us while supporting others and using theirs. We have the capacity to grow and change for the better when exposed to new information and experiences. We believe in our inherent worth and capabilities, and we possess the power to inspire and create change within ourselves and others. We can transcend the confines of the status quo to imagine and design more equitable and humanizing systems. Today, we're joined by Chelsea Pratt, who is going to be speaking with us about the importance of using social justice principles in our supervisory relationships and organizational cultures.
Thank you so much for having me, Rolando. It's really an honor to be a part of the project. I'm so excited about it. So, my name is Chelsea Pratt. I use she, her pronouns. Because of the content of this project, I want to begin by sharing just a few of my salient social identities. So, I'm white, queer, cisgender, and I grew up in Georgia. And I have spent my entire career working in higher education, so doing diversity, inclusion, and equity work. I also am a researcher of inclusive, sustainable organizational cultures, workplace well-being, and workplace trauma. So all that's informed by supervision work. I co-founded a project called the Higher Education Supervision Project with some fantastic collaborators, which I hope I'll get to tell you about them throughout the course of our conversation today, as a resource for folks who want to do trauma-informed and identity-conscious supervision. So a lot of my lens comes from higher education specifically, but I hope that some of the things we talk about today will resonate for anyone who's working in an organization who wants to use social justice principles to create more liberatory supervisory relationships and more liberatory organizational cultures.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really happy that you're here. What are some of the things that activated you in your social justice journey and activated your interest in this topic that you're going to be sharing with us today?
I'll go all the way back to my time as an undergraduate student. I'm a first gen college student, and the entirety of my K 12 experience was either homeschool or religious school. So I had a pretty limited view of the world and attended the University of Georgia and studied sociology, where that limited view of the world was really broken open and started to learn about things that my education had not acknowledged were realities like systemic injustice. And because of that was really driven in between my undergraduate graduation and starting my master's program. I wanted to go out and be in the world and actually do something that made a difference. So I was driven to do something called the Equality Ride, which was a multi-month social justice bus tour run by an organization called Soul Force. That's today. They don't do the Equality Ride anymore. But we traveled across the country to colleges and universities that were picking out students for being queer or trans, firing faculty and staff for being queer or trans, or not officially recognizing LGBTQ plus student groups, for example. So we were traveling to these campuses and having conversations with administrators about policy or doing organizing workshops with students. And this thing that I thought was really meaningful, but almost like a fun thing to do to pass the time in a meaningful way, really directed the course of my career going forward. So in higher education, a lot of those things that I did on the Equality Ride, I ended up doing as part of my job. So working with administrators, pointing out policies or practices that weren't inclusive, working with students on organizing. And I feel so grateful that's where I got my start. My time in higher education, I also had a lot of pretty ineffective supervisors. So folks who were really well intentioned and maybe did a great job at jobs like the ones that I was in. And so because of that, they moved up. That's a pretty common path in higher education supervision and probably in supervision in nonprofits and other spaces as well, as you do a great job in your role. And so you get promoted and it's just assumed you'll know how to manage folks who are in that role as well.
Mm,
And so I was pretty frustrated with that in the early years of my career and pretty quickly moved up and took on supervision of another full time staff and knew I wanted to do things a little bit differently. So I started looking for resources. And this was back in probably 2013. And at the time, there just wasn't a lot. Higher education scholarship has not paid a lot of attention to supervision historically, both in terms of formal studies as well as more practical resource guides. More exists now, but at the time there was really nothing. So I found myself also turning to other fields who I think are doing this a little bit better, primarily the clinical mental health world. So folks in social work and psychology and other clinical mental health are doing a lot of great work on supervision, particularly through a trauma informed and identity conscious lens. So I started pulling from some of those resources and practicing things, trying them out with my team and with my staff. And some of them worked, some of them didn't work. So all of that sort of fed into now what I've devoted some of my research and scholarship to, which is figuring out what are better ways that we can relate to one another in our workplaces, ways that are cognizant of our humanity, of the unique identities and experiences we bring to the table, and that are cognizant of the weight of the work that we do. Because oftentimes in education, as well as in other disciplines, the work that we do is heavy. It's personal and it takes a toll on us. And so I wanted to be able to contribute to supervision resources that would help folks like myself at the very beginning of my career who are looking for ways to do this better, be able to know where to start. So it's a little bit of what brought me here.
you're also a co-founder of the Higher Education Supervision Project as well.
The Higher Education Supervision Project is the practical, tools focused version of my dissertation. So I studied higher education supervision during my PhD program at Ohio State. And I particularly took what's called a participatory action research focus to my work. Often for listeners who maybe have been exposed to research, often research can feel very transactional. It can feel
Mhm.
like there's some representative of the university going to a community and almost being extractive, right? And taking some knowledge away. And then sometimes that knowledge doesn't flow back to that community and it can feel pretty unjust or inequitable. So I have been inspired by participatory action research traditions, which are very much interlaced with community organizing. So I took that approach and worked with friends and colleagues who are all women of color who have worked or currently work in higher education. Through a series of conversations, we sat down and talked about their experiences in higher ed with workplace trauma, with the experiences of being at the nexus of experiencing systems of white supremacy and sexism and misogyny, as well as their experiences with white supervisors in particular, and whether
Hmm.
those white supervisors made those experiences better or worse. And often it was worse. And as a white person myself, it was important to me to be doing this coalitional work with my friends and colleagues and to think about what are the ways that I, as someone who was formerly a white supervisor, could speak to other white supervisors and share some of these tools and resources that are grounded in women of color wisdom. And so that was the genesis of the Higher Education Supervision Project, is having these really generative, rich, deep conversations. And several of the co-researchers that I worked with on that project wanted to build on it and build out some of these supervision resources that now live as part of the Higher Education Supervision Project.
In your work, you talk about the intersection of trauma and identity and the ways in which supervisory practices can make a positive difference for people at work. I've talked with several folks through this project already. And one of the earlier episodes, I talked with a friend of mine who studies the relationship between power, privilege, oppression, and trust, building trusting relationships, particularly the ways that our experiences with oppression can even impact our abilities to trust ourselves when it comes to thinking about our identities that have been marginalized. And I imagine many applications of that as it relates to the workplace as well. And in your work, you're talking about the intersection of trauma and identity and the way supervisory practices can make a difference in that experience.
Yeah. So I'll start with talking about the intersection of trauma and identity. It took me a while to be able to label some of the things that I was experiencing, my friends and colleagues were experiencing in the workplace as trauma. And some of that comes from the way that culturally we talk about trauma. And I think that's shifting a little bit, but often when we talk about trauma, we're thinking about experiencing an act of violence or a natural disaster, or maybe going through chronic childhood instability, right? All of these things are certainly traumatic. But what they often leave out are more insidious types of trauma. So Resma Menakem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, talks about the embodied trauma that happens for Black folks, for example, living in a world that's characterized by anti-Blackness. And I think especially with the high profile incidences of anti-Black police violence that we've seen in the last 4 years, that they've been happening far before that, but they're visible, right? In
Yeah.
sort of popular culture and in the media. So labeling that as trauma, I think, is something that we don't often do. In a similar vein, there's something that clinical mental health scholars have called vicarious or secondary trauma that refers to folks who are doing empathic work. We often talk about it as helping or healing professions. So folks who are in healthcare or who are therapists or who are educators who are on the front lines of supporting students, constituents, clients who themselves are going through traumatic experiences. The weight of doing that work can also be experienced in many ways as trauma. So, studies that have been done on this show that similar symptoms of PTSD for someone who's experienced an act of violence, that can happen from folks who are chronically working with folks who themselves are experiencing trauma. So, for me, I wanted for the Higher Education Supervision Project to think about trauma really expansively as a way that included these aspects of chronic, insidious trauma, identity based oppression, secondary trauma, intergenerational trauma. There's all these really important concepts that we leave out. And so that was the first step of conversations with my collaborators and co-researchers, was to share what are the ways that defining trauma expansively, that trauma shows up in the workplace. And I decided to do some artful components in working with the words of my co-researchers, and ended up crafting a poem from their words that we feel conceptualizes the way that workplace trauma showed up much better than I ever could. So if it's all right, I'd like to actually read that
Please.
poem just to
Pl-
elevate, yeah, to
Please.
elevate voices and to share for listeners some of the ways that this may show up. Again, this is in a higher education context, but my sense is that it's pretty translatable to other contexts as well. I didn't give enough importance and recognition to the trauma that I faced working in student affairs. It took coming out of it to realize that was really toxic back there. I've been told, move on, keep going, just brush it off. I'm realizing now that actually escalated the trauma. It compounded what I was feeling. There's this loss of agency that happens as a consequence of experiencing this compounded nature of trauma. I didn't always speak up when I experienced racialized trauma. I felt like I didn't have the right. I'm an Asian American immigrant woman. In the past, if we stood up for ourselves, if we said something, we would get deported or experience a loss of opportunity. And carrying that burden, sometimes I freeze from speaking up. I'm an Afro Latina. People have said to me, "You're too passionate, you're too emotional, you're too much." I had to curtail myself. I'm a first generation college student. My supervisor discouraged me from applying for a promotion because she said I didn't speak English well enough. I was an English literature major. I still grapple with it today. Will the trauma ever go away? I'm a trauma centered professional. I frequently help people name their trauma for the first time. There were days when I went home and had to just decompress because I felt like I had taken something from someone and applied it to myself. The mother of a Black boy who grieved for Ralph Yarl on the morning of a work retreat. I was the only person of color in that room. Everyone else is moving on with their lives, and there's a little boy who doesn't even have hair on his face fighting for his. What I think is so powerful from my collaborators' words there are the ways that these everyday incidences that become very normalized in so many of our organizations have a traumatic effect, right? I've been in many work retreats where predominantly white folks in the room, and it's the day of or the day after a highly traumatizing incident has happened and nobody even acknowledges it or
Mhm.
speaks about it. I've also been in spaces where I witnessed racial macro and microaggressions happening where, especially I think in organizations, women of color are often told the words like what my collaborator said, "You're too passionate, you're too emotional, you're too much," and the traumatizing effect that that can have on folks. I think that these words, many of them were uttered by supervisors, but it goes beyond supervisors as well. And it really speaks to some of the insidious nature of the ways that trauma shows up in our workplaces and in our organizations. And for me, kind of a core principle of how I think about my own organizing or social justice work is centering the margins. And
Mm.
when we center folks who are at the nexus of multiple forms of oppression, and we hear those folks' insights about what's wrong in our organizations and what needs to change and how it should change, inevitably that benefits everyone, calls that trickle up justice. Even though I think these words are heavy, there's also a lot of wisdom and insight in them that can show us ways that we can transform our organizations for everyone. I'll stop there because I'm curious in the conversations you've had so far and in your work as a social justice educator. Like I said, my guess is that these things are translatable outside of education as well. So what stood out for you in hearing those words
Absolutely.
or what's resonating?
Absolutely. One, I want to say thank you for bringing in the voices of your collaborators and bringing their lived experiences into this virtual room that we are in. That is exactly in the spirit of what what many of the things that ground the importance of this social justice origin stories project. So one, thank you for bringing their voices in. Also, as you were reading and as I was listening to some of the messages, I was reminded. So what I reminded, one, of some of my own experiences being in higher education, but then also my experiences with consulting with folks in organizations and working with folks of color and folks who have other identities that have been marginalized by society in their experiences. So the piece about the person sharing and it feels like everyone's moved on, and what you were sharing around like how it could have been just after some event has happened, the day after or the day of or not long after, and it feels like everyone else is moving on. It speaks to the sense of isolation. And I know I've felt that isolation in different working experiences. And then also as a consultant supporting folks who have also had those similar experiences with isolation too, and it speaks to, for me, things that are resonate for me is this sense of folks join organizations and work in organizations. Yes, there's capitalism that we are still operating within that connects work to survival. In addition to that, I had the experience of working with folks for whom the organizations, the offices, the units that they are there because they deeply believe in the work and the values, the stated values of the organization, and having experiences like that where you're having this experience that is connected to your own identity. You talked about vicarious trauma, so I'm thinking even back in 2020 in this awakening, and I'm using that in quotation marks myself, that many people and organizations seem to have at that time around things that Black people had always known very intimately. And then in many ways, so that sense of isolation, in that I'm sitting here having this experience and it feels like everyone else is oblivious to it, or at least there's this expectation, which adds to it a bit for me when I'm thinking about this and the impact that it has on folks. We're still expected to then go on as if nothing is happening or meet those deliverables or meet those deadlines without any acknowledgement of what might be happening internally. And so, even as you're talking about this, I think about words and experiences and feelings, like institutional betrayal in some cases, feeling completely like, oh, I'm doing this work. And so, a theme that I bring into my work, even that I'm reminded of as you're sharing your story and sharing the words of your collaborators, is that folks with minoritized identities are often in organizations doing major work, but are also having their own experiences too. So we're in organizations and we're trying to alleviate, resolve, bring about more equity, but also just recognize that folks also have identities that are also under attack, could be locally, could be nationally. And supervision, I believe, like the way individual managers and things might not necessarily be able to take all of that away, but I do feel that supervision and how folks are cared for and supported while they are doing that work does make a difference. So something else that came up while you were reading that poem was the person sharing, "Well, I was discouraged by a supervisor to apply for this promotion or this other position because I didn't believe my English was strong enough." So like all of these things swirling around, and the impact that can have on folks with minoritized identities, marginalized identities within organizations, and how supervision plays such an important role in supporting folks or adding to that trauma, those experiences. So thank you so much for, again, for bringing their voices into the room. And as you have done that, it has just underscored why this conversation and this topic and your work is so important. The work that you're joining with others to do is so important.
Yeah. Thank you for also sharing your experience in higher ed and as a consultant. And it was, you know, witnessing some of those things from my colleagues and then witnessing my own negative experiences with supervisors that, like I mentioned at the beginning, really drove me to look into what information exists about this. And what I found is that a lot of staff in higher ed are really dissatisfied with their quality of supervision. And if you're dissatisfied with your supervisor, that's more likely to lead to you feeling burnout in your role or you leaving your role.
Hmm.
And the supervision models that exist in higher ed typically are sort of identity neutral, which I'm also saying in quotes because I personally don't believe there can be any identity neutrality. But by that, they subscribe to this let's treat everyone the same sort of value and don't often take things like identity and power and oppression into account or take into account the ways that trauma can really play a huge role in staff experiences. And for me, I've been really interested in my own research to seek out what is the value of supervision and in what ways can it be a protective factor for staff. And so I've done some quantitative and qualitative work on this, and found that in the numbers world and the quantitative world that um, effective supervision is correlated with higher satisfaction at work, with lower burnout, lower intent to leave, greater trust in your supervisor. But what I think is powerful about qualitative or story focused work that is also powerful about this project is that we get to hear these lived experiences of folks who have had positive experiences with supervisors and folks who have had not so positive experiences and the ways that those make a difference as well. So I'll mention that even though I heard many stories from my collaborators about white supervisors who caused a great deal of harm,
Hmm.
who perpetuated trauma or made traumatizing environments worse. I also heard stories of supervisors of variety of identities
Hmm.
who in some ways resisted these capitalistic organizational cultures and decided to do something different in their own spheres of influence. And like you, I've done some consulting work over the years, and I often find that middle managers or folks who are in a leadership role, but not the highest leadership role, or sort of the bridge between entry level staff and leaders, that can be such taxing and frustrating position to be in because it can feel sometimes like you have no power. Like
Mhm.
your team asking something of you, and then your boss is asking something of you. And it can sometimes feel like you can't please anyone. But I think what's powerful about the stories that I heard about supervisors who did things differently is that they decided to exert some influence over what was in their sphere. And even if it didn't necessarily immediately transform their institutions or organizations, it transformed their staff members' experiences by doing things like simply acknowledging when a traumatizing incident has happened and checking in on
Mhm.
the humanity of your team members and saying, "How are you? What do you need?" Or by intentionally building a relationship and not just saying, "Okay, our one-on-ones are here for us to check in about your projects," but actually asking, "How are you? How are you doing? What do you need? How can I support you?" Um, those might seem like small things, but they can make a big impact. And I think that's where, and I speak from being a former middle manager myself, but that's where middle managers, I think, forget how much power we actually have is by saying, I'm going to resist or do things differently in my own way within this little sphere that I can exert some control over.
What are some of the other ways that you found have been helpful, or some of the themes that have emerged from some of the storytelling you've heard around managers or things that they've done that has been helpful to folks' experience? I think I remember you earlier on in your explanation opening up, and what I got from what you were saying earlier is that in higher ed, sometimes what's viewed as successful management or leadership is connected to output. What are you producing? That's these some of these like tangible things, and the folks who are geared towards that are seen as successful and can move up in other ways. But I've always thought, Chelsea, I've always thought that there are technical ways of doing work, but then there are also very relational ways of doing work and working together and getting things done that involve identity, acknowledgement of that, involve how are we communicating with one another in terms of transparency and sharing information and those different things. Like the relational pieces that influence the way that output or whatever the thing that is produced eventually gets done. What's the way in which we get there? The things that inform that way. So I've always thought that. But I'm wondering, what are some things that you found or that you've heard in terms of things that are helpful? I know you mentioned checking in and just different other aspects or examples of things that you've heard that would be helpful for some managers to know. These are some helpful things to
Yeah.
do as well.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. So maybe before I go into specifics, I'll just share kind of big picture what my collaborators and I tried to do is
Mhm.
pull together what's a guiding metaphor that we can use for all of these things that we're talking about. And we landed on seeing the supervisory relationship as a garden or as something that's living and breathing that you have to cultivate over time. One aspect of that is the soil. So for us, the soil represented the context that we're all in, or as Beverly Daniel Tatum says, the smog in the air, right? And good supervisors who are taking a trauma conscious and identity conscious approach are aware of the soil that we all are growing in higher
Mm.
education. So that means being aware that injustice is happening. For supervisees in particular, that could be at all levels of the process of them joining the team. So some of my collaborators talked about ways that even from just submitting their application, they knew things that they were going to experience based on their name, right? Or how that would be perceived, or what stereotypes or associations there would be with that from that first moment. So being aware of what some of those injustices or inequities could be from application to interviewing to hiring to onboarding, all of that is a part of being aware of the soil. But beyond just being aware, it's also important that supervisors are doing what they can to shift and make changes to that soil so that it's more livable for folks, right? And so that brings us to the second part of the metaphor, which is fertilizing the garden. And there are 5 principles of trauma informed practice: safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and choice, that we're also applying in this project to supervision by infusing in principles of safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and choice into your supervisory relationship. You're inevitably starting to shift and change some of that soil, but it's not instantaneous, just like different plants might need different time to grow, especially if there's an identity differential or power differential, which there usually is in a supervisory relationship, it's not a given that you're going to build that trust straight away.
Hmm.
And we feel that it's on those of us who hold privileged identities, such as being a white person. The onus is on us to do the work to build that trust. It's not something that we can just assume is given to us. And so in my supervisory relationships, I've also seen that it's on me to do the work to model vulnerability or to create that environment of safety and trust, build that over time. In addition to that, though, it's also important to have some ongoing watering and care, right? So you can infuse some of these principles in, but without things like humility, empathy, authenticity, those plants aren't going to grow. Those relationships aren't going to flourish. So my collaborators talked a lot about the importance of reflexivity or being able to, in a self-aware way, critically look at mistakes that you've made or ways that you could have done differently or better and acknowledge that openly and share that actually wasn't my best, or maybe I failed you in this way, or I didn't live up to my own values in this way. Being able to say that really openly, that's a part of what sort of waters the supervisory relationship throughout. And then the final piece is the institutional environment in which supervision takes place. So we call this the greenhouse to call attention to the fact that supervision doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right?
Mm.
Our one on one supervisory relationships are impacted by things like HR policies and practices or institutional leaders. And so that's one thing that was, I think, a positive surprise for me coming out of these conversations is how much we talked about things outside of just supervision that impact supervision. And so the ways that, for example, flexible work policies or the ways that organizations handled remote work during the pandemic,
Come
or
on.
the ways that in education and in nonprofits, folks are not paid an equitable living wage or
Hmm.
given equitable family leave. All of these things um, impact someone's quality of life and are inherently also trauma informed practices. I think we sometimes think about trauma informed practice as something that we do one on one and how we treat one another, which is important, but it also needs to be systemic. And if we truly care about trauma informed practice or employee well-being, we have to go beyond just saying, oh, we have an employee assistance program that you can call into if you need it. Actually be providing folks with the things that they need to be able to live well. Because I think so often in education and in nonprofits, because we do this work because we love it, we tend to think, oh, we don't need to care so much about the hours that someone's working or what they're getting paid to do it because their passion should be enough.
Hmm.
That's actually an injustice and a disservice to folks and is feeding what now we're calling the Great Recession because there's less of a tolerance for that than there used to be, which I think is actually a good thing.
Yes, yes. I think it's a good thing as well. I think it's a good thing as well. I'm wondering to degrees what learnings or what experience or takeaways have you all gained to the extent where you've been able to explore supervisory relationships where perhaps the supervisor had some identities that were marginalized in relation to their supervisees and any dynamics that might arise through that dynamic as well? Has that come up so far in some of your stories and experiences?
Yeah. And there's also two really great books that have come out just in the last couple of years that also talk about this concept in a higher education setting. One is called Identity Conscious Supervision, and one is called Inclusive Supervision. And both of them talk specifically about supervisory relationships across identities and experiences. So I would highly recommend them. Those texts don't necessarily focus on trauma, though. That's just not a part of their model. But I think that for me, even though my relationship with my collaborators on the Higher Education Supervision Project, that was not a supervisory relationship, I think I used a lot of the principles that I've learned as a supervisor in my relationships with my collaborators. And some of that has been, for me, humility. So coming to conversations with a acute awareness of everything I do know and cannot know because it's not my lived experience, but also equal parts humility and curiosity and believing that through hearing one another's stories in relationship with one another, change can happen and transformation can happen. And certainly did that in supervisory relationships when, for example, as the director of an LGBT center, there was a lot at my institution that wasn't great for queer trans people, and particularly for queer and trans people of color on that campus. And so by having humility and curiosity with my staff and with my students, there was a lot that I learned that needed to shift and change, and strategies for how to shift and change it that
Mm.
I'm really grateful for. And it was similar in the Higher Education Supervision Project as well, that they had come into this having done some work around the academic side of supervision, but knowing that's just one form of knowledge. There's a lot of other equally or even more valid forms of knowledge that come from our own lived experiences. So having that curiosity has also been a really organizing principle for, I think, how I view all of my relationships, is that there's always something that I can learn and gain um, through being in true relationship with others, and not that extractive kind of relationship that I think can often happen in
Mhm.
research or in other organizations, where it's just about what can I get from you rather than what can we be together and what can we learn from one another.
Mhm. Now, I have one other question here, and then I want to try to make sure I don't forget to go back to the Great Recession and its connections to supervision. But you talked about watering earlier and explain some things that go into the watering process, equitable supervision. And I wanted to ask, could you speak to the role of feedback, giving, accepting feedback, and how of that can influence that watering process in social
Yeah,
just ways?
yeah.
How does this relate to giving and receiving feedback from supervisors? Maybe even to the extent that supervisors are their relationship with feedback and exploring some of those things.
Yeah. So one of the tangible takeaways from the garden metaphor or analogy is the importance of engaging in ongoing self exploration and education, so that it could be simply just educating yourself around identity and oppression. It could be educating yourself about trauma or supervision. But the other way we learn is through feedback. And 360 feedback or multi directional feedback is still not a super common practice in education, in my experience, but is so invaluable for how we as supervisors can learn more about ourselves. So, for folks who are unfamiliar with that, often in education, feedback is given kind of one directionally, where if I'm a supervisor, then once a year or maybe twice a year, I need to give feedback to my supervisee. It's usually tied to a performance review, and it's very one directional
Mm.
and limited because I only have one perspective on my supervisee. So 360 feedback means the practice of getting feedback from all directions. So I'm getting feedback from my own team or from my stakeholders or from my colleagues, as well as from my boss, and getting learnings from that. So that was a practice that wasn't common the last institution where I worked. So my team and I put together our own twice a year 360 feedback process that we used amongst ourselves as professional staff, as well as amongst our student staff and our graduate staff, and got into kind of an ongoing practice of sharing feedback with one another and admitting really openly how we're learning from that and what we're doing to shift. So I remember one of my first learnings from that process was I worked in an office where it was quite common for us to have evening or weekend commitments, which is not atypical in higher education. And so my staff was often working late nights or on the weekends. And so I would all the time say to them, oh, hey, make sure if you worked late, make sure you come in late the next day. Or I saw you worked over the weekend, pick a day in the next couple weeks to make sure you take off. So I would say that all the time, but I was not good at doing that myself.
Mm.
And what I heard through the 360 feedback process was that spoke a lot louder than what I was saying to my
Yeah.
staff, right? There was this implicit assumption that, like, oh, if that's what she does, that's what I have to do, or that's what she expects of me, which was not true at all. But it showed me how important it is to value sustainable workplace practices, because it's not good for anyone to be working late nights and weekends and then coming in, right? Or be working these 60, 70 out of hour weeks. And so that was a big shift for me. And hearing that in my 360 feedback to to really remember that I need to be modeling and doing some of these things that I'm telling my staff are so important. Um, I think that the one thing that can be a challenge with 360 feedback, and this is just sort of a tension because I think it's such a valuable tool, but it's a tension we have to hold, is that feedback is never identity neutral, right? Feedback is always laden with
Mm.
the ways we internalize oppressive assumptions about others. And I have colleagues who are Black women in particular who have gone through 360 feedback processes and get feedback that's really clouded by racist and sexist assumptions. And so I think for organizations or individuals who want to put 360 feedback processes into place, it's really important that those are put in place in parallel with other kinds of anti-oppressive work. Yeah, feedback is a gift and a wonderful tool, but we can't pretend that it's also not laden with all of these assumptions. It's important that all of us are doing our own work around unpacking those assumptions and unpacking the stereotypes and oppressive ideas that we internalize before we're then putting them out into
Mm.
feedback to others. So that's my one caveat with 360 feedback, but it's such a valuable tool.
Hmm. And I also wanna tease out if I'm hearing that correctly, that you mentioned in your story around that the institution didn't necessarily have 360 feedback as a practice, but then you within your own unit or office created that twice a year 360 feedback. And so when I heard you share that, it made me think about what you shared earlier on around you talked about having been a middle manager yourself and how sometimes middle managers can forget the kinds of power that they still have. And so I'm just wanting to elevate that particular story in that yeah, sometimes we do forget the power that you have, but the creation of that, like the institution didn't do this, but I did this within the sphere, because you talked about sphere of influence. So this is one thing that I've done within my sphere of influence. So the institution may not have had this in place right now, but I have these understandings, these values, this approach to my work, and this is one way to do it. So we're gonna, within what we can control, we're gonna do that with one another. Just highlighting that as one example of something for folks who might be thinking about, okay, what is something that I can do? Or to the degrees that because we're in the experience so much that even the amount of time you talked about folks having to work doesn't always lend itself to those reflective times on our practice. Just highlighting that in that example, that was just one example of a way where, okay, here's something within my sphere that I could do, and we did it. So just wanted to highlight that, and thank you for sharing that. And then also, I wanted to make sure I came back to the Great Recession and just ask again in terms of your work, your lived experiences, your research, the things that you're studying now. What connections do you feel, or what connections can you make with the importance of the socially just supervision and putting social justice principles into our supervising relationships as it relates to how people are experiencing the Great Recession right now?
Yeah. I think that the Great Recession for me is a radical rethinking of work and our relationship to work and the normalized workplace practices that many of us who are millennials, Gen X have just thought were this is just the way things are for such a long time. And I'm sensing it as a lowering of our tolerance for some of those things, recognizing how harmful they can be and wanting to re-envision that, wanting to see something different. And so folks are more likely to leave their organizations when they see that different thing. I think for some of us, that's how we get to do our work. So having remote work and the possibilities in that be opened up for us, I think is a big part of it. I know that's been a big part of my own journey as well, but also things in education that I alluded to, a lack of benefits, a lack of a living wage. I can't tell you how many colleagues I've had who have had to have side hustles or other jobs that they do just to be able to afford because their education salary wasn't livable. So those things as well, I think organizations are having to reckon with the fact that gotten by for a long time, not providing those things for their staff. I think that education is also at a really interesting crossroads right now because Gen Z and Gen Alpha are also rethinking the value of higher education, right? What is this actually going to give me? Is this going to benefit me and my life or what I want to do? And those are really valid questions to ask as well. So it's such a pivotal same, I think, for those of us who work in education and nonprofits, and then the students who we're serving. And I think that for supervisors who are still there in the trenches, I think, like you elevated, remembering that you have some power, especially around time, because I think there can be such a scarcity mindset around time
Yeah.
because we are so used in education to filling our calendars to the max. Um, so I encourage folks to also think about what's in your sphere of influence around, particularly in the time that you get to spend with your team through one-on-ones or team meetings, and remembering that those can be really valuable spaces, not just for relationship and trust building, but also for community care. So, in studies of folks who experience workplace trauma, I know we often talk about self-care, and I'm not going to negate the importance of self-care, but what's actually most correlated with resilience and being able to move through those traumatizing environments is being in community with
Hmm.
others. And I think often when we have this scarcity mindset around time and we're like, okay, I only have 15 minutes, let's go through these 3 bullet points, we miss out on the really high value of cultivating relationships that are characterized by care and having proactive conversations about what's the emotional impact of your work and how are you doing and what do you need. That's missed when we just focus on our transactional work related relationships to one
Hmm.
another.
And see, that right there is what I was trying to get at. In your opening, you just mentioned what, and again, I was paraphrasing there, but the sense I get from it and connecting to my own experiences is that sometimes technical ways of working and output in organizations is uplifted and rewarded in many ways. And I think you said something to the effect around, and so folks they're promoted, they move around, but those skills don't necessarily translate into supervision and tending to some of the things that you've been naming here. And so when you said what I'm getting from it, pause and what is the emotional impact of the work that I'm doing? That's exactly what I'm talking, just being mindful of that element because there is an emotional impact. So thank you for naming that. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that aspect I think is one that deserves so much more recognition and attention. And it's operating still whether we're reflecting on it or not. So it's really important to spend some time in thinking about that. But I just loved how you said that. What's the emotional impact of what we're doing? It's so important to think about that. Who or what are some of the things that have influenced and shaped and influenced your analysis in terms of how you're approaching your work today? Or there people or experiences? I know you've named some folks, you've named some books and things, but any things you'd mention in the moment around people, resources that have contributed to shaping your analysis and how you approach your work?
Yeah. So I mentioned that it's important to me to draw from wisdom that women of color in our institutions or organizations have been saying for years and decades. And so women of color feminisms overall has been a big part of what I've tried to infuse into my own supervisory practice, including Patricia Hill Collins and an ethic of care. I think that ties very much to how we relate to one another and how we can practice community care with one another, as well as Gloria Anzaldúa and thinking about the ways that we all are inevitably interconnected and the ways that our liberations are bound up in one another. There's so much of that wisdom that I think all of us, regardless of our identities, would be well suited to incorporate into our own lives and practice while giving credit where credit is due in terms of the folks who have been generating these ideas from lived experience for, like I said, many years. I think that it's also then important to me to take the energy, the frustrated energy that I felt when I haven't gotten what I needed from my
Mm,
supervisors
mhm.
into, and this isn't everybody's journey, but for me, my journey of resistance has been I'm really frustrated with what I'm not getting. Let me channel that into doing better by my team and by my supervisees and by the people that I work with or spend time with and collaborate with. And I think that that's an aspect of wisdom from our lived experiences that perhaps sometimes we can forget when we get spun out in frustration about
Yeah.
these folks are not treating us in the ways we deserve, which is valid and true. And what are the ways that we have some power, even in small ways, to change things for folks who work with us, and we could break that cycle that often gets passed down. Research says we tend to supervise the way we've been
Hmm.
supervised, and I know it's been important to me to not do that, and to do things like whenever I have meetings with my leadership, to say to my team, what do you want me to take to this table where you're not invited, or these conversations that because of institutional hierarchies you're not a part of? What's important for me to share, to then strategically share things based on that. I used to talk with my team about there's some hills that are worth going to battle on. There are a lot of hills in our work of social justice we can bury under or go around or get bulldozers and move. Like there are so many really creative and innovative ways that we can engage with these obstacles and barriers that we come up across, some of them in really direct ways and some of them in indirect ways. And I think that for me, it's been important to remember that the frustrations I've come up against can be information that can fuel more strategic and creative ways of dealing with injustice in organizations.
Other ways are possible. Those frustrations, those experiences, what we don't want are often connected to values that communicate what we do actually want to experience. And yeah, that's an important distinction too. Yeah. Hey, a lot of those experiences is, yep, it's what I don't want, but also it supported me in thinking, how do I want to supervise? And I think of that as well too. And even in some of my own experiences, it's like, all right, so you did the bi-yearly, twice a year supervision thing, but it's like, hey, and some environments I've been in, it's hey, where there's not folks are feeling like you're not able to take that vacation time or you're not able to take time away, go ahead and do it. Just establishing things within my own sphere as well. It's not seen as if you could necessarily be vocal about asking questions and talk about psychological safety with folks and organizations a lot. So you don't have that learner safety or that challenger safety where you can question things about the processes without feeling as if you're going to be punished in some way. We have that here. Yeah, stuff doesn't make sense sometimes. Here's what I can share with you about that. I loved how you mentioned, oh, what is it that you all want to share or want me to ask when I'm going into these rooms? And yeah, so all the things you were sharing is just reminding me other ways are possible. And so I'll share that with listeners too. Other ways are possible. And those experiences that we have that teach us and that we feel deeply about what we don't like to experience or don't want to experience can be connected to values about what we would like to experience and how we would want to be when it's our turn and role to make those decisions, how we can do things differently. So I appreciate you sharing that message. What are some things that you would want listeners to take away? What are you hoping they'll learn or take away from your sharing today? And then what actions would you encourage them to take?
Yeah. So I think that it's important that with all of these supervisory principles for folks to know that there's not a simple, easy checklist, right? Just like with enacting any justice work or equity work, even though that might make it simple and easy to know, here are the 10 steps you do, and then hooray, you've made it. This is an ongoing process, right? It's ongoing work to practice more liberatory forms of relating with one another, including in our supervisory relationship. I don't have a simple checklist or a list of 5 things to do, but the ongoing practice of being aware of the soil that we're all growing in at our organizations through educating yourself and one another is one strategy. Another is to cultivate humility and to know that whoever you're engaging with, regardless of their level or position in the organization, we all are valuable and valid sources of knowledge. And we all have things that we can learn from one another. So practicing in an ongoing way that humility for yourself, I think inevitably shifts the way that we relate to others. And then remembering that even though we all might feel disempowered in our organizations, we all have some power to um, make change or rectify injustice. So remembering that folks who are supervisors not just be aware of what their supervisees are facing, but can also play a role in trying to shift and change some of the circumstances, knowing that you may not see the changes. So I had a supervisee who was a gay man interested in building his family. And at the time, the institution where I worked had no paid leave for him. Like the way that paid family leave worked there is that you had to physically birth a child to get any paid leave. No other way of bringing a child into your family would get you paid leave. And talked about this during his hiring process. We talked about it during our one-on-ones because this was something he was really interested in. And so I wrote up a proposal, went to HR. I did benchmarking research on what other campuses were doing. Like I was
Yeah.
doing a lot of this work to try and show, yes, this will cost the institution more money, but it's something that we need to do for our team members. And I left that institution in 2020. And it wasn't until 2023 that the family leave policy was expanded, but it was expanded ultimately. And it was many people's work set into that. But I think it can be disheartening at times in our institutions or organizations that are very resistant to change. But knowing that even some of the work that we do that might not see an immediate impact, even knowing that work is building on work that others have done and others are going to build on it when we go on, I think is an important reminder because until we have organizations where everyone feels like they can take the time off that they need to be well, that they have the healthcare that they need, that they are able to have a full life outside of work and any other caregiving responsibilities they have, that they don't have to sacrifice those things for work. Until we have that at our institutions and organizations, we don't have equitable institutions or organizations. Even if those policies are beyond us individually as supervisors or as leaders, there are ways that we can still elevate those as issues that need to be addressed or changed. And so I encourage folks who are listening, who are inspired by that thought, to work toward it in your own ways, to know also when it's time to leave institutions or organizations that don't have your best interest at heart. And I've grappled with this in my own career as well, but making change and advocating um, for injustice to be addressed, that's not easy work. And sometimes it only you can know, I think, but sometimes we need to know when it's time to say, all right, this is not an organization that has my best interests at heart, and I've done what I can, and now it's time for me to move on. Know when that's right to do as well, I think is what I would leave folks with. But I'm often inspired by the words of Grace Lee Boggs, who says that we are the leaders that we've been waiting for. And I think that if we can remember that we have the wisdom and lived experience within us that can fuel our path towards seeking justice, it can go a long way in reminding us of everything we have in a world that often likes to tell us everything that we don't.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So finish the statement. True social justice is possible when.
Social justice is possible when we are aware of the deep interconnections that we have with one another, and when we are truly bought into the fact that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and can see that our liberation is bound up with one another.
My approach to social justice is shaped by.
Goodness, relationality, and creativity, and the ways that our relationships with one another and the connections that we have can be generative, synergistic starting points for creative solutions to changing our organizations.
Understanding and sharing our social justice origin stories is important because.
There's implicit value in our lived experiences, and there's a lot of wisdom that can be gained from sharing our stories with one another. There's also something powerful, I think, that comes from sharing your own story and reflecting on all the things that have brought you to where you are now.
I'm hoping that this storytelling, the collective storytelling of this project will be around for many years to come. Quite honestly, even beyond our time is my hope. And for future generations listening to this who may come across this recording years from now, is there anything you'd like to pass on to them or share with them? Any wisdom, any just message of hope or anything?
Yeah. My favorite thing about Gen Z and Gen Alpha is that collectively, folks in those generations are challenging and rethinking work. And I've gained so much from the ways that those generations are relating to work and demanding for things to change and be different. So my message to the next generation is keep doing that, keep rethinking work, keep challenging the status quo. And if there are pervasive inequities that are just accepted at your workplace or in your institution, that you're valid and wanting to change or rethink those. And I feel grateful for the work that's been done, even up until now, to do that. So keep going.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And as you are grateful for the work that has been done and that is still going, I am very appreciative of you stopping by to share your knowledge, your stories with us, Chelsea Pratt. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Social Justice Origin Stories there or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch video episodes on YouTube at Social Justice Origin Stories, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe there as well. Video episodes are also available on the project website, socialjusticeoriginstories.com. Follow the project on Instagram at Social Justice Origin Stories. I'd love to hear about how you're engaging with the stories. Share your thoughts at socialjusticeoriginstories.com/contact or by emailing stories@socialjusticeoriginstories.com. To support the work of Social Justice Origin Stories, consider becoming a monthly patron. Your contributions will help keep this research going and support its mission. Visit patreon.com/socialjusticeoriginstories to learn more and make a contribution. Again, that's patreon.com/socialjusticeoriginstories. You can start or stop anytime. Social Justice Origin Stories is edited, hosted, and produced by me, Rolando Tompkins Jones. Many thanks to our storyteller this week and the many storytellers who have contributed to this project. And thank you for joining me this week. Take care.